Work or sleep on the street, my daughter said, her voice flat, like she was reminding me to take out the trash instead of throwing her own mother out of her home. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I didn't even look at her right away. I just kept my hands folded on the edge of the dining table, staring at the place where my husband used to sit, the chair still slightly pulled out as if he might come back and finish his dinner. It had only been 9 days since we buried him. 9 days since I stood beside a polished oak casket under a gray October sky, holding on to a grief so heavy it made my chest feel hollow. And now, here I was, being told I was no longer welcome in the house we built together over 38 years. The kitchen smelled faintly of roasted chicken and thyme, a meal I had cooked out of habit more than hunger. Know what I'd really eaten? Ashley had barely touched her plate. Daniel scrolled through his phone like none of this concerned him. And me, I had taken 2 bites and couldn't taste a thing. I'm serious, Mom, Ashley added, crossing her arms. You can't just sit around all day. If you're staying here, you need to contribute. Otherwise, you need to figure something out. I finally looked at her. Really looked. The same girl I used to braid hair for before school. The same girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Her face was sharper now, harder. There was no hesitation in her eyes. No softness, just calculation. I nodded once, slow and controlled, as if I were agreeing to something simple. I understand, I said quietly. My voice surprised even me. It didn't shake. It didn't break. It sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Daniel shifted in his chair, but said nothing. Of course he didn't. He never did when it mattered. I reached for my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my plate. The same way I had done every night for decades. Small habits. Order. Control. Even when everything else was falling apart. I'll take care of it, I added. Ashley let out a small breath, almost relieved, like the conversation had gone exactly how she wanted. Maybe she expected an argument. Maybe she expected tears. I gave her neither. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. My knees felt stiff, but I didn't rush. I wouldn't give her that either, the satisfaction of seeing me stumble. As I turned toward the hallway, I let my fingers trail briefly along the edge of the table, feeling the familiar would grain beneath my skin. This house held every version of my life. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet Sunday morning with coffee and sunlight spilling through the windows. And now, apparently, it held no place for me. Upstairs, the bedroom door was still slightly open. His slippers were exactly where he left them. His watch sat on the dresser, frozen at 2:17, the time they said his heart gave out. I stood there for a long moment, taking it all in, not crying. Not collapsing, just seeing. Then I walked to the closet and pulled out a suitcase I hadn't used in years. The zipper sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. I paused, just for a second, my hand resting on the handle. They thought I had nowhere to go. They thought I had nothing left. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again, steady and clear. They were wrong. I woke up before sunrise, the way I had every day for the past 38 years. My body still following a rhythm that no longer belonged to anyone but me. The house was quiet, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I used to know. It felt hollow, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening for a sound that would never come again. No footsteps in the hallway. No soft clearing of his throat. No voice asking if I wanted coffee. Just silence. I sat up slowly, the blankets falling neatly into place behind me, and reached for the robe hanging on the bedpost. It still smelled faintly of the lavender detergent I had always used, a small detail that suddenly felt too sharp, too real. Downstairs, the kitchen looked exactly the same as it had the night before. 2 plates still in the sink. A glass half full of water near Ashley's spot at the table. I moved through the space carefully, as if I were a guest in someone else's home. I rinsed the plates, dried them, and placed them back in the cabinet with quiet precision. Small actions. Controlled. Necessary. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, the same seat I had occupied for decades. The chair across from me remained empty, pushed back just slightly, untouched. I did not move it. I could not. Outside, The early morning light stretched across the backyard, pale and cold. The maple tree we planted when Ashley was born stood tall, its leaves just beginning to turn. I remembered holding her as a baby, standing right there by that window, promising her a life filled with safety, with love, with a home she would never have to question. I took a sip of coffee. It had gone bitter. Somewhere upstairs, I heard movement. A door closing. Soft footsteps. Life continuing, as if nothing had shifted, as if the ground beneath my feet had not been pulled away the night before. I did not look up. Not when Ashley walked into the kitchen. Not when she opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of juice. "You should start looking today," she said casually, like she was talking about the weather. "There are plenty of places hiring. Grocery stores, diners. Something simple." I nodded once, my eyes fixed on the surface of the table. The wood grain blurred slightly, but I blinked and it steadied again. "I will," I said. My voice was even. "Calm." She lingered for a moment, as if waiting for more. For an apology. For gratitude. For anything that might confirm I understood my place now. When nothing came, she turned and walked out of the room. The back door closed behind her with a soft click. I finished my coffee in silence. Then I stood, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the rack to dry. Everything in its place. Always. I walked back upstairs, past the bedroom that still held too many memories, and into the small study at the end of the hall. The desk was exactly as he had left it. Papers stacked neatly. A pen aligned perfectly with the edge. I opened the top drawer slowly, my fingers brushing against envelopes, documents, things I had not yet had the strength to face. Until now. They thought I was alone. They thought I had nothing. I pulled out the first folder and set on the desk, my hands. Steady, my breathing slow. If they wanted me to survive on my own, then that was exactly what I was going to do. Just not in the way they expected. I sat down at the desk and opened the folder slowly, as if whatever was inside might disappear if I moved too quickly. The paper felt heavier than it should have in my hands. Legal documents, bank statements, property records, all things I had trusted my husband to handle for years without question. I had never needed to look. I had never needed to doubt. Until now. The first page was dated 6 months before he passed. I traced the date with my finger, my breath steady but shallow. That was around the time he had started spending more evenings in this room. The door half closed, his voice low on the phone. I had asked him once if everything was all right. He smiled, the same gentle smile I had known for decades, and said he was just organizing things, making sure I would be taken care of. I believed him. I always believed him. I turned the page. My name was there, not just mentioned, but clearly written, underlined in a way that felt intentional. Primary beneficiary, sole owner, the house, the accounts, everything. I blinked once, then again, making sure I was reading it correctly. My chest tightened, but not from fear. From something else. Something sharper. Something clearer. I continued flipping through the pages, slower now, absorbing each line. There were signatures. Not just his, but a witness. A notary. Official. Final. I set the papers down carefully, aligning the edges with precision, just as he always had. Downstairs, I heard Ashley's voice again, faint through the floorboards, speaking on the phone. Her tone was different now. Lighter. Confident. "Yes, we are handling it," she said. "She will be out soon. Then we can move forward." I did not move. I did not react. I just listened. A pause. Then a soft laugh. No, she does not know anything. She never paid attention to this stuff. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words settle, not as a wound, but as confirmation. When I opened them again, the room felt different. Smaller. Clearer. Like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. I reached for another envelope inside the folder. This one was sealed, my name written across. The front in his handwriting. The sight of it made my fingers pause for just a second. Then I opened it. Inside was a single letter. I recognized the way he wrote immediately. Steady, careful, familiar. I read it slowly, each word landing exactly where it needed to. He knew. He had seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to prepare. Enough to protect me in a way I had not realized until this moment. I folded the letter back along its original crease and placed it on the desk. My hands are no longer trembling. They were still, completely still. Downstairs, the front door opened and closed. Silence followed. I stood up, smoothing my hands over the front of my sweater, a small automatic gesture. The same one I used before greeting guests, before stepping into any situation that required composure. I looked around the room one more time, at the desk, the chair, the quiet evidence of a man who had thought further ahead than anyone gave him credit for. You always did plan ahead. I murmured softly, more to the space than to anyone else. Then I picked up the folder, held it close, and walked out of the study. They thought I was unaware. They thought I was weak. But the truth was already sitting in my hands. And for the first time since that night at the dinner table, I was not reacting anymore. I was preparing. I carried the folder back into the bedroom and set it down on the edge of the bed, right where his side used to be, the fabric still slightly indented, as if time had decided to pause there out of respect. The morning light had shifted, stretching across the carpet in long, pale lines, and for a moment I stood there, letting it settle over everything, over the dresser, over the photographs, over the life we had built piece by piece without ever imagining it could be taken apart so quietly. I moved to the closet and opened it slowly. His shirts were still arranged by color, just the way I had organized them years ago, white to blue to dark, each one pressed, each one familiar. My hand hovered over the sleeves, but did not touch. Instead, I reached for the suitcase I had pulled out earlier and set it upright on the bed. The zipper opened with a soft, steady sound, not rushed, not hesitant, just final. I began with the essentials. A few sweaters, 2 pairs of shoes, the navy dress I had worn to the funeral, still hanging where I left it. I folded each item carefully, smoothing the fabric with my hands, aligning the edges, creating order where I could. Downstairs, I heard voices again. Ashley had returned. The tone of her voice was sharper now, more focused. "We need to list it as soon as possible," she said. "The market is still strong, and we cannot just let it sit." A pause. Then Daniel, quieter, uncertain. "Are you sure about the timeline?" Another pause. "She is not going to fight it," Ashley replied. "She does not even know what she is entitled to." I closed the suitcase halfway and sat down beside it, my hands resting lightly on the lid. The words did not sting the way they might have yesterday. They did not shake me. They simply confirmed what I already understood. I looked around the room again at the framed photograph on the nightstand, the one from our 30th anniversary. We were standing on the porch, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling into the sun like we had all the time in the world. I picked it up, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, then wrapped it in a scarf and placed it carefully inside the suitcase. Not everything, just enough. Enough to carry forward. Enough to remind me of who I was before all of this, and who I still was beneath it. I stood and moved to the dresser, opening the top drawer where I kept the smaller things. Jewelry I rarely wore. Letters I had saved without rereading. I selected only a few pieces, closing the drawer with quiet precision. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Each choice was deliberate. Each movement controlled. The house no longer felt like mine. Not in the way it used to. It felt like a place I was passing through, a place I was leaving behind, one careful step at a time. I zipped the suitcase fully this time and stood it upright beside the bed. For a brief second, I rested my hand on the handle, not because I was unsure, but because I was steadying myself for what came next. Downstairs, the voices faded. Again, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the ordinary sounds of a life continuing without me. I took one last look at the room, not searching for anything I had forgotten, but acknowledging what I was choosing to leave behind. Then I picked up the folder from the bed and held it close against my side. They believed this was the end of something. They believed I was walking away with nothing. I stepped into the hallway, my posture straight, my steps measured, my expression calm. They were still thinking in terms of loss. I was already thinking in terms of what came next. I walked down the stairs with the same steady pace I had used for years, one hand lightly brushing the railing, the other holding the folder close against my side, not as protection, but as certainty. The kitchen came into view slowly, the familiar space now carrying a different weight, like a stage where everyone already knew their lines except me, or at least that was what they believed. Ashley stood near the counter, her phone pressed to her ear, her posture relaxed in a way that told me she felt in control. Daniel sat at the table, a mug in front of him, his fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic as if he was waiting for something to happen but did not know what. Ashley glanced at me briefly, then turned her back slightly, lowering her voice just enough to signal that the conversation was not meant for me. "Yes, I will handle it," she said. "We just need a few more days." I moved past them without interrupting, setting my suitcase gently by the front door. The wheels clicked softly against the hardwood floor, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel looked up at that, his eyes following the movement of the suitcase, then shifting to my face. There was something there. Not quite guilt, not quite concern, just awareness. "You are leaving already?" he asked, his voice careful, as if he did not want to choose the wrong tone. I paused, turning just enough to meet his gaze. "I said I would take care of it," I replied. My voice remained even, controlled, the same calm surface I had been holding since the night before. Ashley ended her call and set the phone down on the counter, crossing her arms as she faced me fully now. "That is probably for the best," she said. "It will make things easier for everyone." Easier. The word lingered in the air, light and casual, as if it carried no weight at all. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I'm sure it will," I said. I reached for my coat, slipping it on slowly, smoothing the sleeves down over my wrists, adjusting the collar with deliberate care. Small movements, familiar rituals, control in the details. Ashley watched me, her expression unreadable for a moment, then settling back into that same composed distance she had worn since the funeral. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked, though the question sounded more like an obligation than genuine concern. I picked up the suitcase handle, my grip firm, steady. "Yes," I answered simply. It was not a lie. It was not the full truth either, but it was enough. Daniel shifted again, his chair scraping softly against the floor as he stood halfway, then hesitated, as if unsure whether to step forward or remain where he was. In the end, he did neither. He just stood there, suspended in that space between action and inaction, exactly where he had always been. I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the handle, not because I needed time, but because I chose to take it. I looked back once, not at Ashley, not at Daniel, but at the room itself. The table, the chairs, the window where the morning light now fell brighter, warmer, as if nothing had changed. This had been my home for decades, and now it was simply a place I was leaving. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool air meeting my face with a clarity that felt almost sharp. Behind me, I heard Ashley's voice again, already moving on, already continuing. The door closed with a quiet click, final but not heavy. I walked down the front steps, the suitcase rolling behind me in a steady rhythm, each step measured, each movement intentional. They believed I was walking away with nothing. They believed this was the end of my story. But as I reached the sidewalk and turned toward the street, the folder held firmly at my side, I knew something they did not. I was not leaving empty-handed. I was leaving prepared. I did not look back as I reached the corner of the street, even though I knew exactly what I would see if I did. The same house, the same windows, the same front door that had just closed behind me as if it had already forgotten I existed. The morning air felt colder out here, sharper against my skin, but it cleared something in my chest that had been heavy for days. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and kept walking, each step steady, measured, not rushed, not uncertain. The sidewalk stretched ahead of me in a long, quiet line, empty except for a few fallen leaves gathering near the curb. I had not planned where I would go in the way Ashley expected. There was no rushed phone call, no desperate search, no panic. There was only direction. I reached the end of the block and paused briefly, just long enough to take a breath and shift the folder into my arm. Then I turned right, toward the main road, toward a place I had not visited in years but had never forgotten. The bus stop came into view, a simple bench beneath a faded sign, the paint chipped at the edges. I sat down slowly, placing the suitcase beside me, my hands resting on the handle as I looked out at the passing cars. People moved through their morning routines, unaware, uninterested, each of them carrying their own lives forward without interruption. For a moment, I let myself blend into that normalcy, just another person waiting, just another quiet figure in the early light. Then I opened the folder again, careful, deliberate. The documents inside were no longer overwhelming. They were clear, structured, intentional, just like him. I turned to the letter once more, reading a single line again, not because I had forgotten it, but because I needed to feel it settle fully into place. He had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to act. Enough to make sure I would never truly be at their mercy. A bus pulled up in front of me with a low hiss, the doors opening with a soft mechanical sound. I stood, lifting the suitcase with a controlled motion, and stepped inside. The driver glanced at me briefly, then nodded, a small acknowledgement that required nothing in return. I paid the fare and moved down the aisle, choosing a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb, the neighborhood began to shift outside, houses giving way to small shops, quiet streets opening into busier roads. I watched it all without attachment, without hesitation. This was not escape. This was transition. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up with a soft glow. There was only one number I needed. I had not called it in years, not since before everything became routine, before I stopped asking questions. My finger hovered for just a moment, then pressed. The line rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered, older now but steady. "Robert Hayes," he said. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. "It is Margaret Collins," I replied. There was a pause on the other end, a shift, subtle but immediate. "Margaret," he said, more carefully now. "I was wondering when you might call." I opened my eyes and looked out the window as the bus moved forward, carrying me farther from what I had left behind and closer to what had already been set in motion long before I realized it. "I believe it is time," I said quietly. And for the first time since I walked out that door, I allowed the smallest hint of certainty to settle into my voice. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, just enough to mark the beginning of something they had never prepared for. The bus came to a slow stop in front of a quiet brick building I had not seen in years, its windows tall and reflective, the brass letters beside the doors still polished, still precise, still exactly the way I remembered them. Hayes and Associates. I stepped off carefully, pulling the suitcase behind me, the wheels catching briefly on the edge of the curb before settling into a smooth rhythm again. The air here felt different, steadier somehow, as if this place had not changed while everything else had shifted without warning. I paused for just a second on the sidewalk, looking up at the entrance, not with hesitation, but with recognition. Then I walked forward. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that held purpose instead of emptiness. A woman sat behind the front desk, her posture straight, her expression professional but not cold. She looked up as I approached, her eyes briefly scanning me, the suitcase, the folder in my hand, taking in more than she needed to say out loud. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "I have an appointment with Robert Hayes," I replied, my voice calm, measured. She nodded once, already reaching for the phone. "He is expecting you," she said, confirming what I already knew. Expecting. The words settled into place without surprise. I took a seat in the waiting area, placing the suitcase beside my chair, the folder resting neatly on my lap. The minutes passed quietly, but they did not feel long. They felt aligned, like everything was finally moving in the same direction. A door opened down the hallway, and Robert stepped out, older than the last time I had seen him, his hair thinner, his shoulders slightly more reserved, but his eyes exactly the same. Sharp, observant. He paused when he saw me, not in shock, but in acknowledgement, as if a long-standing assumption had just become reality. "Margaret," he said, walking toward me with steady steps. I stood to meet him, offering a small nod instead of an embrace. There was no need for anything more. "Robert," I replied. He gestured toward his office, and I followed, the sound of the suitcase wheels echoing softly against the polished floor. Inside, The room was organized with the same meticulous care I remembered. Files aligned, desk clear, everything in its place. He closed the door behind us, not abruptly, not quietly, just deliberately. "I take it you have seen the documents," he said, moving to his desk. I set the folder down in front of him, my hand resting lightly on top for a moment before letting go. "I have," I answered. He nodded once, opening it, scanning the pages with a familiarity that told me he had read them many times before. "Your husband wanted to make sure there would be no confusion," he said. "No room for interpretation." I watched him as he spoke, not with urgency, not with anxiety, but with a calm understanding that had taken me years to reach. "He anticipated resistance," Robert continued. "Not necessarily from you." A faint pause, just enough to make the meaning clear. I sat down across from him, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "They believe I have nothing," I said. My voice was steady, not defensive, not emotional, simply factual. Robert looked up at that, his expression shifting slightly, not surprised but confirming. "That is because they have only seen what you allowed them to see," he replied. Silence settled between us, but it was not empty. It was precise, intentional. I leaned back slightly in the chair, the smallest movement but enough to mark a shift. "Then I think it is time they see the rest," I said quietly. And this time, there was no softness left in the space between the words. Only clarity, only direction, only the beginning of something they had never prepared for. Robert did not respond immediately. He closed the folder slowly, aligning the edges with a level of precision that mirrored my own movements earlier that morning, then rested his hands on top of it, as if he were placing something firmly into position. "Then we proceed," he said, his voice measured, controlled, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not require emphasis. He turned slightly in his chair and reached for a separate file on his desk, thinner, but no less deliberate in its presence. "There are a few things you should understand before we move forward," he continued. I nodded once, my gaze steady, my posture unchanged. I was not here to be convinced. I was here to act. He opened the second file and slid a document across the desk toward me. "Your husband transferred full ownership of the property into a protected structure 6 months ago," he said. "Legally, it cannot be sold, transferred, or modified without your direct authorization." I looked down at the paper, scanning the lines, recognizing the signatures, the dates, the language that once would have felt distant but now felt exact, almost familiar. "Ashley does not have access," Robert added, watching my reaction carefully. "Not now. Not then." I let the words settle without expression, but inside, something aligned with a quiet certainty. Not relief, not satisfaction, just confirmation. "She has already begun making inquiries," Robert continued. "We received a call 2 days ago. She requested documentation regarding the title and potential listing procedures." I lifted my eyes to meet his. "And?" I asked. "We declined," he said simply, "on the grounds that she has no legal standing." A brief silence followed, but it was not empty. It was structured, like a space being cleared for the next move. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting loosely in my lap. "She believes I'm leaving with nothing," I said. My voice remained even, not sharpened by anger, not softened by doubt. Robert gave a small nod. "That assumption will not hold for long," he replied. He reached for another document and placed it beside the first. "There is also a financial component," he said. "Monthly distributions that have been redirected, accounts that were adjusted. Your husband anticipated potential interference." I did not ask for clarification. I did not need to. The pattern was already clear. Every step, every decision, every quiet moment he had spent in that study had not been distance. It had been preparation. "What happens next?" I asked. Robert folded his hands, his gaze steady, direct. "Next, we make your position visible," he said. "Formally, legally, without confrontation, but without ambiguity." I considered that for a moment, not weighing options, but acknowledging sequence. This was not about reaction. This was about timing. "And if they resist?" I asked. "They will," he replied calmly. "But resistance does not change documentation." I allowed the smallest pause, just enough to let the words settle into place, not as reassurance, but as structure. Then I reached forward and placed my hand lightly on the documents, aligning them with the edge of the desk, a small, controlled gesture that marked the shift from understanding to action. "Then we begin," I said. There was no need to raise my voice, no need to emphasize the moment. It was already defined. Outside the office window, the city moved as it always had, steady, indifferent, continuous. Inside, something far more deliberate had just been set into motion, not loud, not sudden, but precise enough to change everything that followed. Robert did not rush after I spoke. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a step that had always been inevitable, then turned slightly toward his computer, his fingers moving with quiet precision across the keyboard. The room remained still, but it was no longer passive. It felt active now, like a space where decisions carried weight the moment they were made. "I will have the notice drafted immediately," he said. "It will be delivered formally. No room for misinterpretation." I watched him as he worked, the steady rhythm of his movements reinforcing what I already understood. This was not confrontation. This was structure. This was clarity being placed where assumption had been allowed to grow. "They will receive it today," he added. I nodded once, not because I needed confirmation, but because I accepted the timing. Today. Not later. Not eventually. Today. I stood slowly, adjusting my coat with the same deliberate care I had maintained since I left the house, my hands smoothing the fabric, aligning the edges, reinforcing the quiet control I had chosen to hold. Robert looked up at me then, his expression thoughtful, measured. "Where will you go?" he asked. It was not concern in the emotional sense. It was practical, direct. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I have options," I replied. He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if that answer was sufficient. "Good," he said. "We will remain in contact." I picked up the folder, holding it firmly at my side, no longer as something fragile, but as something defined. "Thank you, Robert," I said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had preserved without needing to explain it. "Your husband made sure of this," he replied. "I'm simply following through." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the truth in that. Then I turned and walked toward the door, my steps steady, unhurried, each movement aligned with the decision already set in motion. The hallway outside felt quieter than before, or perhaps I was simply hearing it differently now. I passed the front desk with a small nod to the receptionist, who returned it without question, as if she understood more than had been said. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, the sunlight stronger now, casting sharper lines across the sidewalk. I paused for a brief moment at the top of the steps, not out of uncertainty, but to take in the shift. The city moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged, and yet everything for me had already begun to realign. I stepped down onto the sidewalk, the suitcase rolling behind me in a steady, controlled rhythm. Somewhere across town, a document was being prepared with my name on it, not as a formality, not as a placeholder, but as a declaration. Ashley would receive it. She would read it. And for the first time, she would see something she had not anticipated. Not emotion, not resistance, not pleading, but fact. I continued walking, my path no longer uncertain, my direction no longer reactive. This was no longer about where I had been forced to go. It was about where I had chosen to stand. And by the time the notice reached their hands, the version of me they believed they understood would no longer exist at all. I chose a small hotel 3 blocks from the law office, not because it was remarkable, but because it was quiet, clean, and temporary in the way I needed it to be. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, the kind of neutral comfort designed for people passing through, not staying long enough to leave a trace. I checked in without conversation beyond what was necessary, my voice steady, my movements precise, the same controlled rhythm I had carried with me all morning. The room was on the 3rd floor. Modest, orderly. A bed, a chair, a small desk near the window. Nothing excessive. Nothing personal. I set the suitcase down beside the dresser and stood there for a moment, not to rest, but to register the shift. This was not my home. It was not meant to be. It was simply the place where I would stand while everything else moved into position. I unpacked only what I needed. One sweater, a pair of shoes, the photograph wrapped carefully in the scarf, which I placed on a nightstand without unwrapping it. Not yet. Some things did not need to be seen to be felt. I washed my hands in the bathroom sink, the water running steady, grounding, then returned to the desk and placed a folder in front of me. The light from the window fell across the papers, clear and direct, leaving no part of the page in shadow. I did not open it again. I did not need to. Everything inside had already been set in motion. Instead, I sat down and folded my hands, allowing the quiet to settle around me, not as emptiness, but as space. A few hours passed this way, marked only by the slow movement of sunlight across the carpet and the distant sounds of traffic below. I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for distraction. I remained still, aware, present. Then my phone vibrated softly against the desk. I looked at the screen without urgency. Unknown number. I let it ring once more before answering. Hello. My voice remained calm, unchanged. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to confirm what I already expected. Then Ashley spoke. Mom, she said, her tone different now, tighter, controlled in a way that felt unfamiliar. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the silence to exist, to stretch just enough to shift the balance between us. We received something, she continued. From a lawyer. Another pause. This one shorter, more deliberate. Yes, I said simply. The word carried no explanation, no emotion, only acknowledgement. I could almost hear her adjusting, recalibrating, searching for a position she no longer fully understood. What is this? She asked. The question was direct, but the certainty behind it had begun to thin. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my gaze steady on the window, on the city, moving beyond it without interruption. It is clarification, I replied. My tone remained even, measured, leaving no space for argument within the words themselves. There was a sharper inhale on the other end, the first sign of something shifting beneath her composure. This does not make sense, she said. We already discussed. I let her stop herself. I did not interrupt. I did not correct. I simply waited. You assumed, I said quietly. Not accusing, not raised, just placed exactly where it needed to be. The silence that followed was different now. Not empty, not uncertain, defined. Ashley did not respond right away. And for the first time since this began, I could hear it clearly. The absence of control. Not gone, not broken, but no longer complete. I remained where I was, my hands still, my posture unchanged, my voice steady when I spoke again. Read it carefully, I said. Then I ended the call, not abruptly, not dramatically, just finished. I set the phone back on the desk and looked out the window once more. The city continued as it always had, but somewhere else, in a house that no longer belonged to me in the way it once did, something had already begun to unravel. The room remained quiet after the call ended, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet I had felt that morning. This one carried movement beneath it, like something shifting just out of sight, something beginning to settle into a new shape whether anyone was ready for it or not. I stood from the chair slowly and walked to the window, resting my hand lightly against the glass, not for support but for stillness. The street below continued without interruption. Cars passed. People walked. Life moved forward in its steady, indifferent rhythm. And somewhere within that same flow, Ashley was standing in the kitchen, holding a document she did not understand, reading words she had not expected to see. I could picture it clearly without needing to be there. The way her posture would stiffen first, then her eyes would move faster across the page, searching for a mistake. The way Daniel would hover nearby, asking questions she could not immediately answer. The way the space around them would begin to feel smaller, tighter, as certainty slipped out of their hands. I closed my eyes briefly, not to imagine it more vividly, but to acknowledge the shift. Then I stepped back and returned to the desk, sitting down with the same measured control I had carried all day. The phone remained where I had left it, silent now, but I knew that silence would not last. And it did not. It rang again less than 10 minutes later. This time, her name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a moment, not hesitating, but choosing the timing, then answered. Yes. I said, no greeting, no softening, just presence. You need to explain this, Ashley said immediately, her voice tighter now, the edges no longer smooth. It says the house is not even in my father's name anymore. It says it cannot be sold. That is not possible. I listened without interrupting, allowing her words to fill the space, to reveal what she had understood and what she had not. It is possible, I replied calmly. The simplicity of the answer seemed to land harder than anything else I could have said. There was a pause, shorter this time, but more unstable. When did this happen? She asked. Months ago, I said. No elaboration. No explanation beyond what was necessary. I could hear her breathing shift on the other end, faster now, less controlled. Why would he do that without telling me? She demanded. The question hung there, not directed at me, as much as it was directed at the space where her assumptions had once been. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting loosely in my lap, my voice steady when I answered. He did not tell you because it was not yours to manage, I said. Silence followed, not the kind that waits for a response, but the kind that marks a boundary. For the first time, there was no immediate pushback, no quick correction, just the absence of certainty where it had once been absolute. You said you had nowhere to go, she said finally, her tone quieter now, not soft, but searching. I let that settle for a moment before responding. You assumed that as well, I said. My voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. Controlled, measured, final. On the other end of the line, I could hear the shift clearly now. Not collapse, not defeat, but something more precise. Realization. And once it appeared, it did not leave room for anything else to remain the same. I did not wait for her to speak again. I ended the call gently, placing the phone back on the desk with the same quiet control I had maintained all day. Then I sat there for a moment, my hands still, my breathing even, my posture unchanged. Nothing around me had moved. The room remained exactly as it had been. But somewhere else, everything had begun to change. The afternoon light had begun to soften by the time the phone finally stopped ringing altogether, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt uncertain but settled, as if something had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be forced. I remained seated at the desk, my hands resting lightly against the surface, my posture unchanged, my breathing even. There was no urgency in me now. No need to anticipate the next call or prepare for another question. Everything that needed to be understood had already been placed exactly where it belonged. I stood slowly and walked to the nightstand, unwrapping the photograph I had brought with me, the fabric falling away in a single smooth motion. I looked at it carefully this time, not through memory, but through clarity, his arm around my shoulders. The way he stood slightly angled toward me, as if even then he had been positioning himself between me and something I could not yet see. I set the photograph upright against the lamp and stepped back, allowing it to exist in the room without being held. Downstairs, somewhere beyond the walls of this building, life continued in its ordinary rhythm, but I could feel the distance now, not just physical but defined. I walked back to the desk and opened my phone, scrolling briefly, not searching for anything, just confirming what was no longer there. No missed calls, no messages. The silence from Ashley was not empty. It was deliberate. It was the space where certainty had once lived and now could not return in the same form. I placed the phone back down and sat again, folding my hands in my lap, the same composed position I had taken all day. The difference now was not in my posture, but in what stood behind it. Hours passed quietly, marked only by the gradual dimming of light across the room. When the sun finally dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the floor, my phone vibrated once more. This time, I recognized the number. Robert. I answered without hesitation. Margaret, he said, his tone steady, but carrying a slight shift beneath it. Not concern, not urgency, but confirmation. The notice has been acknowledged. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of relief, but to register the finality of that statement. I see, I replied. There was resistance, he continued, but it did not alter the outcome. Of course it did not. I had never expected it to. They requested clarification, he added. I allowed the smallest pause before responding. And it was provided, he said simply. I nodded once, even though he could not see it. The structure held. The boundaries remained intact. Nothing had shifted where it mattered. You are fully within your rights, Robert said. There is no ambiguity left. I opened my eyes and looked at the photograph again, the steady presence of it anchoring the moment without needing explanation. There never was, I said quietly. The line fell silent for a brief moment, not awkward, not incomplete, just finished. We will proceed with the next steps when you are ready, Robert said. I considered that, not as a decision to be made, but as a continuation already set in motion. I am ready, I replied. I ended the call gently and set the phone down once more. The room remained still, unchanged, but the air within it felt different now. Not heavy, not uncertain. Clear, defined. I stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the city as evening settled in, lights beginning to appear one by one, steady and unremarkable. Somewhere else, in a house that no longer held the same meaning, conversations were unfolding without control, without certainty, without the structure they had relied on for so long. I did not need to hear them. I did not need to be there. Everything that needed to happen had already begun, and for the first time, there was nothing left for me to react to. Only what came next to be carried forward, exactly as it was meant to be. The night settled fully by the time I turned away from the window, the city lights steady and distant, each one separate yet part of something larger, something that did not pause for anyone. I walked back to the bed and sat down slowly, my hands resting in my lap, my posture still composed, still deliberate, but no longer held in place by tension. The day had not been long in the way hours are measured. It had been long in the way understanding unfolds, one piece at a time, until there is nothing left to question. I reached for the photograph again, lifting it carefully, studying it not as a memory to hold on to, but as something that had already done its work. He had seen further than I had. He had prepared for what I could not yet imagine. Not with fear, not with control, but with clarity. I placed the photograph back on the nightstand and stood, moving toward the suitcase, opening it just enough to adjust what I had packed earlier. The movements were small, precise, not because they mattered on their own, but because they reflected something larger. I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was moving forward with what had already been secured. I closed the suitcase again and left it by the door, not as a sign of leaving, but as a sign of readiness. My phone remained silent. There were no more questions, no more attempts to reframe what could no longer be controlled. Ashley would be thinking now, recalculating, trying to understand where the shift had occurred, where her certainty had broken. But the truth was simple. It had never been hers to hold. I walked back to the window one last time, not to look outward, but to acknowledge the distance between where I had been and where I now stood. The house I had left that morning no longer defined me. The roles I had carried for years, the quiet accommodations, the patience that had once been mistaken for limitation, all of it had settled into something else. Not anger, not regret, just recognition. I turned away from the glass and moved toward the light switch, pausing briefly with my hand hovering near it. The room was still. The photograph remained in place. The folder rested on the desk, untouched but understood. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. I turned off the light, allowing the room to fall into a calm, steady darkness, not empty, but complete. Then I walked to the bed and lay down, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my breathing even, my thoughts quiet. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the continuation of what had already begun. But tonight, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, nothing left to endure. Only the quiet certainty of a life that had shifted, not by force, not by chance, but by something far more deliberate. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in days, there was no weight pressing against my chest, no echo of words meant to diminish me, no need to replay what had already been resolved. They had believed I would leave with nothing. They had believed I would disappear quietly into whatever space they allowed me. But I had not disappeared. I had stepped forward. And in doing so, I had taken back everything that had always been mine, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the only way that truly mattered. Completely.